So Jordan Love, we have an update on him. Looks like it was a confirmed adductor strain or groin strain, likely that adductor longus as we talked about before. The good thing about adductor strains is that they only cross one joint line and they're much smaller fibers without that much myotendinous extension. So they can typically be a 0 to 2 week recovery period. I do think he is at risk for missing this upcoming week based on how significantly painful it was, but unlike previous possible reports of it being a multi-week absence, it looking kind of scary. It looks like this is the best possible outcome, and I would give him about a 50% chance at suiting up this weekend versus the Lions. Adductor strains are responsible for bringing the leg closer to the midline, as well as also a secondary hip flexor. So if he does go out there, I would expect a little bit of limitation, but nothing that would prevent me from starting him, but you can ask about some possible options. Drake May, he suffered a concussion. It was a helmet-to-helmet hit. He actually ended up playing 4 plays after that. They ended up calling down from the NFL office saying that he should be evaluated further, and then they ended up pulling him out for the remainder of the game. So with concussions, we've gone through these 5-step protocols. It's less likely that he'll be able to suit up within 1 week, but most players do return within 2 weeks. So I would give him about a 40% chance of suiting for this upcoming game. Some things to keep in mind are that there are supplements that can help increase the neuroplasticity, basically make your neurons be a little bit more resistant to suffering a concussion, the long-term side effects from it. So we've talked about omega-3 fatty acids, we've talked about flavonoids, and we've talked about creatine. We haven't really talked about how that happens. So when your brain takes a hit, the channels end up getting dysregulated, and with the sodium, potassium, as well as calcium, they ended up flooding into that neuron, and then they end up releasing an abnormal amount of glutamate. The body has to release a ton of ATP to help that recover, and also that can kind of damage the neuron fields, as you can imagine, with there being an inordinate amount of electrolytes. So what these substances do is they help make those channels more durable and help prevent that inundation of electrolyte release, and just something to look into. So everyone wants to know about Brian Thomas. Apparently, he was supposed to be out for 2 to 4 weeks, according to initial reports, with a rib injury, but then they got MRI results which were clean. It sounds to me like they were doing an MRI to not just rule out a rib fracture, but to check for this costal cartilage, because a cartilage injury can actually be more painful than a rib fracture because there's not as much blood flow to that area, so usual pain medications aren't able to penetrate that cartilage as easily. So they do an MRI. He said it was all clean, so that means that there probably aren't any aberrations in the cartilage area. Could just be an intercostal muscle injury, which is basically a muscle that runs right along the rib, or a bruised rib. So I actually think that he's not definitely out for this upcoming week. I'll give him about maybe a 50-40% chance of suiting up, but shouldn't be out more than 2 weeks. We've also talked for some pain options. You can actually do an injection right at that nerve. You want to do it above the ribs. As you can see, there's not any arteries above the ribs, but below it, it's a high risk area. So Stefon Diggs, we got an update as well, but not a definite update. There is a high concern for an ACL. Usually the testing for that's pretty consistent, so I would be highly concerned about him having an ACL season-ending injury. The way that we test for that is we brace the femur and we brace the tibia and we try and pull forward and backwards. It's called the Lockman test, and if there's significant shifting, then that tells us there's a high chance of the ACL being ruptured in the acute setting. Once you're even a day out, though, the test becomes much less accurate because of the swelling and guarding of your leg along with the pain makes it difficult to get an actual accurate estimate of that test. But they do a reconstruction for it, so they don't repair the actual tendon that's there. They actually take another tendon, and it can be a piece of your hamstring, it can be a piece of your quadricep muscle, or they can actually take a ligament to the patella tendon, technically a ligament. They could also take a piece of that, or they can take a cadaver graft where they take it from a dead substance. Jared Goff was also listed with an ankle injury, but he didn't miss any time in the game from it, and afterwards he said it wasn't a big deal, so that tells us that it's a low ankle sprain, meaning not that anterior tibiofibular ligament, but more so the ATFL or the CFL, which are on the low ankle, and do a little bit of stabilizing, but you're able to play through them. So I wouldn't be concerned for Goff to take a seat from his honestly pretty impressive fantasy season thus far, and great line season. Anthony Richards ended up tapping his head and leaving the game for a couple plays, and it sounds like he just said he was out of breath, which is pretty wild. I haven't really heard of an NFL quarterback just doing that, and it sounds like it wasn't very well received by the coaching staff. They're thinking about putting in Flacco this upcoming weekend, and honestly, I think the starting job throughout the year is always going to be a little bit tenuous. So if Downs has for some reason ended up on the waivers again. I would absolutely pick him up. He's a must start whenever Flacco's in there. And he had a great game with Anthony Richardson as well. But I'm not quite sure what Anthony Richardson's status is going to be going forward. It doesn't seem like there's any injury concern, but it does sound like they are starting to question his work ethic. Really unfortunate news about Christian Kirk. It looks like he fractured that clavicle. When you take a direct impact to the front of that upper collar region or a shoulder impact where your shoulder slams into the ground, you're at risk for an AC joint sprain or clavicle fracture. The clavicle, interestingly enough, is the first bone to start forming and the last bone to completely fuse in your 20s. So the things that determine whether it's operatively fixed, which most of them are not, is how much overlap, if there's a significant shortening of the clavicle, or if the clavicle bone is pushed significantly backwards or displaced, putting the blood vessels at risk around that area, then it could be operated on. But typically, it's anywhere from an 8 to 12-week recovery, and we should see him back without any kind of deficits next season. So he's done for this season, but in terms of next season, if you play Dynasty or if you're thinking about redraft, he should be back at the same form level. This doesn't really show any kind of significant performance reduction. I do think the end has come for Jordan Mason as a quality running back, though. He aggravated that AC joint sprain. With Christian McCaffrey coming back, I don't think Jordan Mason's going to be sustainable going forward. Deebo was going off to a good start, and then he got ruled out with an apparent rib injury. Honestly, we talked about this before. His respiratory status was severely compromised for this game. I'm not surprised that he wasn't able to make it through. I do think that he should be able to rest a little bit this week. They'll probably get him out there again this week, but I do think he has a chance of being limited until after that upcoming bye. So I didn't want you to start him this past week, but I would be okay with you firing him up this coming week, even with him being limited with another week of rest. Jaire Alexander also had a knee injury. It sounded like it was non-contact as well, but he was after the game taking pictures, looking in good spirits, didn't seem to be significantly bummed about it. I would be less thinking an ACL in this regard and possibly them grading an MCL injury and seeing how that might be severity-wise, but I'm not thinking a season-ending injury for Jaire Alexander.